Hi there. How is everybody? Yeah, it's a crazy world out there right now. That's why I thought I would share this on the internet. I was asked to give a talk tonight by a community leader on the dynamics of mass communications, mass media, and news media. So basically, like, how can we determine the authenticity of certain messages that are being delivered, and like how do we stay informed in a world where not all media organizations are behaving right, and it's not just the media organizations, it's the information that's kind of being fed, and the trickery that's kind of going on around the world is so some journalists just aren't equipped to handle that. They're becoming more equipped, but it's not easy. So in this talk tonight, I'm going to be talking about all those things, but I'm looking at some notes over here on my left, but I thought that, if there are people that can't make it, and maybe I could just put this on YouTube and just like see how it helps people. I think my biggest thing that I want to do is to make sure that people feel empowered, and that they feel, that I give them some tools to be able to navigate this. So like, just to be able to use your own discernment. I'm not going to tell you like how to navigate or dissect every single media message that comes your way, but just give you some tools where you can do that on your own, and just some things to consider when you're checking for news and information. First thing I'd like to ask you is like, where do you get your news, and how many of you are getting it from social media? And especially in a time when, AI is getting better and better, I would be weary of looking to social media for news. Sorry, I kind of skipped over my credentials here. Why are you hearing from me? Right? Which is actually an important thing in information gathering, is like, who is your source? And as someone who's been a news editor, I would, one of the things I would ask my journalists is like, why are we talking to these people for this particular story? What is their title? Why does the reader care to hear from them? So I'm going to do the same for you. Why would you care to hear from me? So I got a master's in journalism that I completed in 2008. I went immediately to go work for daily newspapers. Shortly after that, I moved back home to get married and start a family. And it was around 2009 and 10 when the economy was really messy. Couldn't find any jobs back at home at a news organization full time. So I started teaching at a local college. And I wanted to teach news writing because that's what I knew about. And they said, well, that's a more advanced class and you don't have any teaching experience. You only have a master's. So they asked me to teach media literacy, mass communications. And I was like, I don't know anything about that. And they're like, didn't you take a class in your master's program? And I was like, yeah. So they kind of threw me in with that class, and I ended up loving it because media literacy is so important. Again, this was 15 years ago, 16 years ago, but it's more important than ever today, even back then. So I'm so grateful for the experience, and I taught it for 12 years. I did eventually get to start teaching news writing 2 years into my teaching career. But back to media literacy, the reason why I loved it is because it is a study of our society. It is basically it reminded me of like a sociology class, because media mirrors humanity. It mirrors our societies and our cultures. So like whatever we are gathering from media, this kind of reminds me, the first thing that always comes to mind in this is like when the Kardashians kind of started hitting the TV screens. You saw like the Kardashians became popular, right, because of the what culture was craving and desiring at that time. But it also, then you started to see culture start to mirror the Kardashian lifestyle and the look and the clothes and the materialism and all of that stuff. I mean, we already have grown. The materialism that existed in our society before is what gave that show popularity, but at the same time, also the drama in the show. We'll talk about that with news media, but that drama in reality TV is something that really drives up ratings. Anyways, so all that to say is that I taught that course for many years, and the textbook was immediately out of date, because as soon as technology changes, the effectiveness and the power of a media message also evolves with technology. So, that textbook was out of date within 6 months, because as soon as something like Twitter was introduced, it was that long ago, or as soon as something like Instagram or TikTok was introduced, then like the whole world of media would change. And so I had to do a lot of my own research in order to make this class feel like it was worthwhile for students. So and while I was teaching for all those years, I practiced freelance journalism. So I was a kind of a long form magazine writer, and I helped run student publications for the district. And so I kind of had my one leg in teaching and one leg in the actual journalism world. And then later in my career, just in the last 5 years, I kind of moved up to, kind of walked away from teaching and started started an editor, kind of more leadership roles, and teaching in that way, right? It's kind of different. You're just in the newsroom teaching versus in the classroom, but it's real life stuff. So anyways, that is why I feel like this is important to talk about, because mass media has the ability to shape our reality. And if we are moving through this world not awake, then it can really take power over us and dictate the way we navigate our lives and the decisions that we make. So so that's kind of the beginning. I'm not going to go into everything. I think I'm going to do like a couple part series for this. So if you are feeling that media has gotten messy over the years, more messy the last few years, you're not alone, and you're not imagining things. We'll just say that. And one of the reasons why we've kind of gotten further away, there's a couple things I'd like to talk about. The history of regulation of media and the lack of regulation, and why that's important. And then the economic model of the economics of media, right? So like how an organization makes its money, its profit, is going to dictate the authenticity of the message. So we'll go back to regulation. We all know about free speech, enacted in the late 1700s. Let's see, 1791. I have it here somewhere. But free speech was, and free press is in order to kind of protect the media as like the fourth estate, and add it as like the checks and balances of like the 3-branch government, right? So like if you had news media as as in just another layer of like accountability, so there is no one centralized system of power. This was something that our country and its founding thought was very important, because it was formed in rebellion to a monarchy, right? That had ultimate authoritarian kind of rule. So free speech and free press was something that was like built into our system of government to protect against stuff like that. So our government has always been very, very careful with like regulating the media for that reason. And the media also does not want to be regulated, because it gets tricky. We don't want state-run media, right? Because then it's just propaganda, mouthpiece. So what happens then, let's see, where was I? Media. So kind of once the problem, is that also our government and our country prizes capitalism, which is great. That's not a problem. But, it can become a problem in some ways, right? Because once something is chasing a profit, it can tend to lose its integrity. So a news organization that is a for-profit organization can do certain things to make more money that aren't necessarily in the best interest of the public. You started to see that a lot at the beginning of the 20th century with an era called yellow journalism, where sensationalism was out of control. Headlines were out of control. They were literally making up news, making up wars, like in other countries, in order to gather an audience. And so at some point we have, you have there's concern over like the way this is impacting the country. So the Henry Luce, I believe, formed the Hutchins Commission and had some research conducted on why it's important for media to behave, for lack of better words. And so at that point we had we decided that if news media, if we don't start, this was in 1947, just to give you a timeline, if we don't self-regulate, then the government's going to come in and start regulating us. And that is in direct conflict with our free speech. So we better do something about this. So at that point, the Hutchins Commission formed this kind of standard and ethical standards, and then the Society of Professional Journalists also formed a list of ethics. And so you can look up journalistic codes of ethics on your phone right now if you want. And I think it would be good for you to become privy as to like what are some of the ethical standards that journalists are aware of, and just to kind of, you have your own idea of like what they're not, in what ways they may not be behaving. And to be fair, a lot of the different codes of ethics are in direct conflict with each other. So for example, you have a duty to be timely. You can't really sit on like an important story for too long. The public has a right to know in a timely manner, but you also have a duty to be accurate. And if you move too quickly and if you're too timely, then accuracy can kind of fall out the window. So those two are two kind of ethical codes that can be in conflict with each other. So it's important that, we can't be perfect, right? You have to kind of pick your battles. And I tell you these two things about news media regulation history and speech law. No, that's also part of regulation history. Oh, I'm sorry. And then like kind of the for-profit, because lost my train of thought. Hold on. Oh, because I want you to know that like people who enter into the world of journalism, into the profession, they study these things. There are regulations in place. There are ethical codes in place. There are laws in place. And you do not get out of journalism school without studying all those things. You learn most on the job. So that's why, when the economy did start to crumble a little bit, I would say when like the print media started to kind of fall by the wayside, gosh, that's a whole other thing, print versus broadcast. So I'll have to do that in a separate video. But once print started, like losing advertising, we'll just say that, then veteran journalists were more expensive and they started being let go. And there was a big turnover rate with a lot of like new, fresh journalists that were willing to be paid less. The problem with, and investigative journalism is also really expensive. So it not only does it require like it's a more advanced skill set, but you have to work sometimes like 6 months on a story. And I've had mentors and editors that would just get handed a credit card and then they would go to like Mexico for 6 months to investigate a story. That doesn't happen anymore, really. And so once you sort of lose the money for like the more senior reporters who know all of these things, it's the quality of news starts to fall apart a little bit. Anyway, so so you kind of start to see like it's not that these ethical standards and legal standards not the same thing. I want to make sure we know that there's a difference between what's ethical and what's legal. Something can be legal and be completely unethical, and something can be ethical and be illegal. So, but journalists and media practitioners are privy to these. And if they are not as privy as they should be, their editors should be. Now, I'm going to talk from experience for a second about working for like local magazines at times. They sometimes will hire like an English major to run their organization, and they don't have fact checkers. So that's kind of a tricky situation because there's not a lot of there's not a lot of concern over quality and ethics in some of those places. So now I will say that I was, just 2 years ago, I was an editor for a local nonprofit news organization, and they do have pretty high standards. So that was really refreshing to see. Okay, so let's see. I've got my little checklist over here. Make sure I remember a few things. Okay, yeah, so how do you determine the authenticity of a media message? The first thing I would ask yourself is like, where is it coming from? So like, what news organization is it coming from? And how does that news organization make money? Does it come from, is it a 24-hour news cycle that's producing it? Is it a for-profit business? So this is this is not a political conversation I'm having. This is, both media outlets on both sides of the spectrum have misbehaved. So like, is this a for-profit organization? If so, I want you to know this right now, that their number one priority is not to tell you the information that you need to know. This is actually a test question on one of the multiple choice tests that blew me away, that came out of the test bank of the textbook that I taught out of. And it just shook me, because I was like, no, everyone's who's in the news business, first priority is to tell the news. No, they're in a capitalist world, a for-profit news organization. The number one priority is to make a profit. There are all sorts of tactics for making a profit. So if one of research shows that the human brain is really intrigued by disastrous, scandalous, train wreck situations, fear-based content. Market research shows that fear-based content drives ratings. So what do you think they're gonna do with that valuable information? They're going to pump out a lot of very eye-catching story and news. That does not mean that there are not disasters happening in the world and that there is not disastrous things that we should not be informed about. It's just that when that becomes the only focus, it's like it frames reality, right? So we tend to think that the lens and where the camera is pointed is like the only, my dog, is the only, is the reality. It's like where the news camera's lens is pointed, that's where all the things are going on. That's not true. There is a whole world outside of the camera lens, a beautiful world outside of the news media's camera lens. It's just that news is by definition a report on change, a report on something that's new, that's happening. And so with that said, things changing are sometimes uncomfortable, right? We don't like change. So that can also be why you see some negative kind of, stop it, negative things going on in the news. I had something else I wanted to share, but I'm blanking. Okay, so yeah, so what is the intent? So I would just say, I personally don't spend any time on a news website or TV channel that is a 24-hour cycle, where their entire job is to fill space for 24 hours and repeat some of the scariest information that you could possibly hear over and over and over. And so, yeah, nonprofit news and independent news, there is a misconception that because that it is federally funded, that it's government funded. In reality, only 1% of nonprofit news is federally funded. It goes up, that's for radio and print or digital. It's a little more, I think it's like 10% for PBS, public broadcast. And there's, Great Britain has the BBC. So that's an example of their nonprofit, state-funded, government-funded news organization. Because of our, back to our values of journalism as the fourth estate, when the government started funding nonprofit news organizations and public broadcasting, like in that way, they knew to stay out of it. So just because it's government funded does not mean that it's state run or that the government has any say in how they behave. And again, so little of it. I think as I'm speaking, Doge is actually drilling the CEO of PBS and NPR right now on their left-leaning behaviors in the news. And that the whole reason why the government originally decided, I think Edward Minow talked about media had this potential to be a vast wasteland if we let consumers' appetite dictate the content that was being produced on a mass level. And so there was some legislation around like, okay, how can we do this? Let's like fund programming that's actually like the broccoli and the hearty meal and the healthy meal versus like the junk food of media. And so that's why we got into that and started funding and supporting. But Joan Kroc left, of McDonald's, left like I think a $200 million endowment for public broadcasting. And so there, a lot of how they operate is funded from that. And it's also funded from donors and sponsors. So I personally support my local public radio station and have for many years. Very impressed with the work they do. So they have more of they tend to, because nonprofits are not focused on ratings and attracting, because ratings attract advertisers, and advertising is the funding model for most for-profit organizations. And so because there's no need to attract advertisers through ratings, they tend to produce more pure content that will serve, that's like they have more like a social responsibility to the public. They're not as focused on like entertaining you. In broadcast news, as we've seen, there's definitely like an element of entertainment, right? There's like attractive news anchors, really loudmouthed news commentators that kind of bring that train wreck element to like where people really want to focus on what's happening there. I remember when COVID hit, I just couldn't turn off the 24 news cycle. I knew better, but then part of me just like forgot. I don't know. I went back to sleep. And I was finally in June 2020, I just turned it all off, and I haven't gone back. Okay, so that leads me to another thing that's important that I want to share is like, we are sometimes, we're not really aware of what we're looking at. And so there used to be a really clear distinction, right? There was like a news anchor or a news commentator. And so a news anchor is there to deliver the news. A news commentator comments on the news. A parallel distinction can be made in a newspaper. There is a section of the newspaper that is opinion columns, and it is clearly marked as such, ethically marked as such at one point. And then there's the news section. And there was never any, and at some point it was extremely unethical for a opinion columnist to ever report on the news and vice versa. They didn't kind of ever go back and forth. And at one point it was kind of a taboo for a journalist to go and do public relations, and then they were never at one point allowed to go back into journalism. That is also like not a thing anymore, partially because journalists don't make enough money. But so if you are watching the news and there is a news commentator and the producers might, in a for-profit organization, might encourage this news commentator to be boisterous and obnoxious and extreme in their opinions because eyes are glued to that. They're watching that, right? So like, but the unaware media consumer will take that as news. They will take that as truth, and they will gobble it up, and then they will share it. And research shows in media theories that most people get their facts for elections. I think this was called the voter studies back in the 1940s or 50s. But think maybe, yeah, kind of hazy on my dates, but research showed that most people got their information from opinion leaders in the community. They call them opinion leaders. This could be a pastor. This could be like, your local minister, a teacher that teaches your class. So, stated the obvious there, teacher that teaches your class. However, so people get, like, when people get these, they tune in or they read like an opinion column, they take it as fact, and they tend to kind of forget that this is not news. This is someone's opinion. And so when we take opinions as news, it can be really dangerous. Now, another thing that makes money are opinions. So in the name of profit, news organizations have started to blur the lines between opinion and news for that profit. That is not done everywhere, and I'm not trying to like criticize all media organizations or even any one particular organization. It's just like, I just want you to be aware of that. Okay, again, so like just understanding those big picture things, economics of a media organization, source, news opinion, news, straight news, and the history of regulation. And I would become familiar with media ethics, and I want you to know all of this so like you can hold media organizations accountable and then take your energy elsewhere. Like, you don't need to be, I just want you to take your power back from wherever you've been leaking it out, whether it's like to your, when we watch the news and we take that as gospel and we take that as like universal truth, we are giving away our power. And if we're not using discernment, we are giving away our power. So I just want you to be empowered to, like, you get to put your energy where you want to. Now, a lot of people have said, and I have made this mistake too, that I've just completely checked out. I am no longer like watching any news. That's one way to go about it. And I've done that a lot. However, it's dangerous, because if we are uninformed, we cannot possibly be engaged, productive citizens of our society. We cannot make good decisions. We cannot know how to navigate or protect ourselves. So like, imagine if all of us unplugged from what was going on in today's world, how disastrous that could be, and how much control we would inadvertently give to people who may not have our best interests at heart. So I think it's important that we do stay informed. So I think you having these tools will help you stay informed and empowered, and pick news sites that feel good to you. It's no different from like when you're shopping. Well, that's so weird. When you're at a party and there are various personalities in the room, some people you'll get a bad vibe from and you'll back away and not give them your energy. Some people will have good vibes, right? And you'll be like, this person knows what they're talking, this feels good, this resonates for me, like the information they're sharing. I'm gonna go look it up when I get home, but I like this person. I'm gonna stay here and listen and talk to them. So like, do the same thing with media messages and news. What feels good, what doesn't? I take a spiritual approach to everything. I can't separate it from anything. So I'm just like, what energy is coming off of this thing, and where am I wasting and leaking out energy to other things? So like, what we focus on grows. If we focus on the problem, which is what a lot of news organizations tend to do, the problem will grow. This is ancient wisdom, right? The tale of two wolves. We focus on the solution, then that's the thing that expands. So let's hold a vision for like a better world. Let's hold a vision for more authentic storytelling and news. I would love more authentic news that's less focused on money and more focused on like what people need to know and hear with a whole big picture. Because I there's so many things I could get into here that I'll get into in a later video, but just because the news is covering something, that doesn't mean it's the whole world. But just because it's not covering something, it doesn't mean it's not happening either. There's something called news fatigue. Research, again, shows, market research shows that when a news organization spends too much time on one disaster, which they initially started covering, we'll talk about like AIDS epidemic in Africa or the huge earthquake in Haiti. I remember hearing about this. They'll cover it at first because it's like, yeah, it's a disaster. The ratings are just like through the roof. But at some point, ratings start to drop and viewers start to lose interest because they either feel helpless, they can't do anything about it, or they're bored of the topic and it makes them feel bad about themselves because that's just so sad. I don't want to hear about that. So news media will actually like set the agenda and also take away, once they take their camera lens away from the issue, we tend to think that the problem just went away. Think about the war in Ukraine. My 13-year-old son asked me the other day, I was like, is that still happening? Yeah, it is. But now it's being talked about more these last few weeks for various reasons that we all are aware of. But there was, a time where we weren't really talking about it anymore. The news stopped covering it as much because people lost interest. Doesn't mean that the war is over. Doesn't mean that people aren't suffering there. So I want to empower you to check your sources, check news in different countries, check the BBC, check Sky, I don't know about Sky News. Just use your discernment. What feels good in your heart? Anything that's loud and boisterous and conspiracy based, it's not for you. It's not for the community. It's not for the betterment of society. I hope you found this helpful. I hope, that this empowers you to make good decisions for yourself and your community, because how we stay informed, not only because we have a social responsibility, right? And we have a responsibility to ourselves to stay sane. So I would unplug from the things that are hurtful, plug into the things that offer solutions, that give you information, that empower you to act in ways that you can. We can't change the world entirely by ourselves, but we can arm ourselves with information and team up in our communities and figure out how to make change and create change by holding a vision for a better way. All right, take care. Until next time.